Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. I'm recording this intro late in the evening from my kitchen in Almaty, thinking about how to summarize the conversation that you're about to hear. I'm a bit under the weather, and you may actually hear it in my voice, and really not much comes to my mind at the moment. What I can say for sure is that my guest this week is one of the most fascinating contemporary scholars from Kazakhstan and Central Asia in general. She has recently published an excellent book that I highly recommend to anyone interested in today's Kazakhstan, Kazakhstani society, and its ever-changing identity. The book's title says it all. What does it mean to be Kazakhstani? It was written by Diana Kudaibergen, a cultural and political sociologist and lecturer in Central Asian politics and society at University College London. Diana has written extensively about Kazakhstan and has published 3 other books as well. You will find a link to her profile in this week's newsletter, and I really encourage you to check it out. As always, if you enjoy Turan Tales and want us to keep going in the ruthless media world, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Go to turantales.substack.com/subscribe and choose one of 3 support options. Trust me, every subscription makes a huge difference. Now, welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I must say that I really loved your book and that reading it was really humbling, I would say, because it challenges so many of our assumptions and the things that we take for granted. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.
And of course, I'm tempted to start by asking what it means to be Kazakhstani, but I think I probably should start with something else. So what brought you to researching your own identity?
I think I got the book idea around 2020. So it was, I would say, during the first months of the pandemic, they were quite challenging. And being locked down, not only from the society, but also not being able to go back home, that felt very strong. And so I needed some project that would, maybe take my mind away a little bit. And I remember talking to a friend and I said, I really need to focus on some things so that I won't be too depressed in a way by the fact that I can't move. And at that time, my post-PhD was I was traveling to Central Asia almost every month. So for me, being stuck in England in my apartment was very strange. So I think it came from a crisis, but not a crisis of identity. I think I'm very firm of where my identity comes from, but it felt from the crisis of not being able to access that familiar home and where I wanted to go at that time.
Well, we can talk about your identity in the beginning a little bit. So how do you see yourself? How have you been defining yourself within Kazakhstan?
I think I'm very Central Asian, and I think it's the first book where I touch a lot on where I come from and who I am and so on. It felt very strange and difficult to write these things, but I'm very grateful to the Hearst team, to my editor, Ben Noble, Michael Dwyer, and Alice Clark, who all 3 of them were encouraging me to, write differently, put myself more on the page. That was a very interesting but also challenging experience. But my identity formed in my grandma's courtyard. As I write in the book, she was very anti-Soviet, anti-colonial. She viewed Soviet Union as a colonial empire. She believed that ethnicity and division into ethnicity was like a colonial tool, an instrument of dividing and codifying people and confining them to categories that they could not escape. I come from a very mixed family, so we have all sorts of cultures, languages, dialects in my extended family. Every wedding you go to, from when my cousin's getting married, There are all sorts of rituals that are shared across the whole region. So there's there can be a point of serving something from Uzbekistan or talking a dialect of Chinese and so on, or wearing like a dress of, I don't know, Uyghur or Dungan communities living in Kazakhstan. So it's a very mixed perspective. And I grew in the context where there was no hierarchy according to, who comes from where, but also the ethnicity was not the most important thing. And in my high school, also, everybody was super mixed. Nobody really questioned where they came from. Later on, I only found out that people came from places like China, places like Zemey or Semipalatinsk, because they were escaping the effects of the polygon, for example, right? But we didn't discuss these things as children. We didn't discuss these things as high schoolers. And then at the university, because it was such a big and kind of like international university in a sense, everybody was demanding to put your identity on the map, and you had to be coming from somewhere. You had to identify by a certain ethnicity. And it really struck me that the biggest challenge in the university was actually this question, who you are, where you're from. And that to me felt so weird. I was like, nobody ever asked me that question. So for me, identity is about being Central Asian, is about embracing this diversity and mixture and richness of cultures, embracing multilinguistic approaches as well. And it's about this polyphonic, plural vision of what Kazakhstan is and what Kazakhstani means as well. But also it's about, I call it in Russian, многоголосие or multi-voiceness. Like, there are so many different voices, so many different stories that make up your ancestry that you cannot just say, like, I'm just this one thing and this one thing dominates who I am. I think paying attention to these multiple voices in our ancestries and also multiple silences, because there's so much in my familial history that is erased, killed off, and that never had a chance to speak for itself because these people were essentially exterminated. So, bringing things like that, or they were killed during the famine or during the repression. So bringing these things and thinking about the multiverse and multi-voiceness is very, very important for my own personal identity.
Looking at the 20th century and Kazakhstan's history in the 20th century, we see that Kazakhstan has been home to some of the Soviet Union's worst experiments. So it faced deportations of numerous nations into its territory. Of course, Gulag, a horrific man-made famine, the Stalinist purges, and also what you mentioned, it became ground to the Soviet atomic tests. So how all those really terrible experiences have affected Kazakhstani identity?
That's a very big and complex question, because as I say, even Kazakhs have an incredibly diverse identification, and it's not just about Ru or tribes, it's also about localities. In terms of Kazakhstani, I think all of these horrific traumas and historical tragedies influence the people who live in that place strongly. I think it would require an enormous oral histories research project. I think it would be very important to interview people who left Kazakhstan as well during the 90s. Well, I know that there is some research is being done right now in Germany about ethnic Germans who were born and lived in Kazakhstan, who were, of course, forcibly deported to northern Kazakhstan during Stalinist period. So looking into diversity of voices would be very, very important, diversity of experiences. And of course, I'm writing from the perspective of third or fourth generation of people who go through these kind of like legacies. I'm very attentive to voices like, for example, Agrim Sityenova, who is an anti-nuclear feminist activist who's younger than me. And she says that she's the third generation survivor, for example, of the atomic bombs testings. And she comes from Semey, from the city of Semipalatinsk, because it used to be called during Soviet Union. So, looking into these generational aspects that we maybe did not experience firsthand. I mean, like when I was born, probably gulags were closing down and the testings were actually coming to an end. So these things, these legacies, I think are even more detrimental and painful because we have to grasp with them and we have to make sense of, what it means and how it influences us. I think it's a very big question that I don't think that just one book, either mine or whoever else's, cannot cover in full. I think it requires this multitude and magnitude of efforts, thoughts, voices, experiences of people who have gone through that. So I think we're still only in the beginning of unwrapping what it means. only in the beginning of unwrapping of what to do with it and how to move forward. That's why I'm very attentive to what my compatriots are doing. I should mention my friends from Kazakh Indie Music Collective who have worked on a performance called Barsak Kelmes that premiered at Celine Center for Contemporary Culture. And precisely at the heart of that performance and kind of like musical performance and musical happening is this idea of can we move forward from these traumas? They're centering on the idea of the ROC a little bit. And the ROC obviously disappeared because of the Soviet Union and the experiments that they were staging in the region. It's not only the Kazakh tragedy, but also Uzbekistan was affected. And I think most parts of Central Asia as a region was affected by the disappearance of the ROC. But they're looking into that perspective and they're looking into a more hopeful ending of that. A sort of like, can we liberate ourselves of these traumas? Can we heal somehow without forgetting that this was happening, that all of these atrocities were happening, but at the same time, can we move on to the alternative future where we can be free of these colonial traumas? And I think I like that perspective a lot. I like that position on something very, very tragic, but also at the same time, it's an alternative thinking and it's very fresh to look at that performance and to look at their voices and what they do with it, but also what they do with the Kazakhstani identity at the same time, because they playing with multilinguistic approach. There are people singing in Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Russian. They're taking aitas, which is the traditional Kazakh or Central Asian kind of like improvised poetic competition, you can call it, right, between two people. And aitas for us is traditionally, of course, and that's how we know it, is traditionally done in Kazakh or in Kyrgyz. So it's done in these languages. But at the same time, what Samrat Ijasov, who is the main director, and Anwar Dusimbinov, who is one of the participants and fantastic poet, what they're doing is that they're transforming aitas into a Russian language, and they're talking about all these traumas in the language of the colonizer, but at the same time, they're transforming that language and they're transforming the form in itself. So I think that does something tremendous to the change of what Kazakhstaniness means, but also tremendous to what we do with these colonial traumas, including the loss of Kazakh language for a lot of communities living in Almaty, for example, right? And the performance was done in Almaty. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating take on creative approach, but also transformation of these ideas, because we cannot always be stuck in traumas. We have to move forward. We have to find ways to survive and essentially move on and focus on other things. And again, for me, Samrat Tama, he's a singer known under the name Samrat Tama, is one of these very fresh, young, creative voices who take that perspective forward. He's 27 years old. He was born after the Soviet collapse. And I think his generation is a little bit tired of being stuck in this traumatized perspective. And so he says that maybe we need to move forward. But of course, we need to tread with carefully, because we can move forward from maybe remembering and being careful about certain survivors and victims. But at the same time, other things we cannot easily forget or heal from, like the detrimental aspects of the atomic bombs testings. And I think that will stay with us for a very long time. Voices like that are very interesting in thinking what we can do with that. At the same time, I don't think my book should be the answer to all of these questions. I think we should do it collectively.
I would like to focus on how the state has been trying to create this Kazakhstani identity after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Because you write in your book that what Nazarbayev was trying to do was basically a continuation of this Soviet experience. Can you please maybe explain how you see this nation building or like identity building project under Nazarbayev?
That's another huge question that I think I've dedicated 2 books to now, the Towards Nationalizing Regimes. But this book is also written after Nazarbayev resigned and left the scenes. I finished it after the Bloody January protests. I think in all my writing, I make this distinction that there is the state, and the state is, not Nazarbayev, obviously. The state is comprised of institutions, but it's also comprised of people. So we need to pay attention to the people on the ground. We need to pay attention to the society. And then there is the regime. So when we talk about personalities, when we talk about who are the elites, what the presidential administration is doing, and so on, I think in the context like Kazakhstan, that is inevitably non-democratic, or you can call it authoritarian or whatever, but essentially it's non-democratic. So it means that people do not have wide access to the institutions or wide access to the decision-making within the state. If they have that, they have to fight for it. They have to fight for it through the protests, or they have to be heard through petitions, which is, again, something that developed in the past few years, precisely through the kind of like of the protest movements that started with the resignation of Nazarbayev, that essentially did not bring any democratization, but cemented the transition to even more authoritarian rule. Well, I don't want to go into comparisons just yet, but essentially what we're talking about, the decision making within the state, it comes from the regime. That's why the previous books and so on, I talk about the nationalizing regime rather than nationalizing state. And the regime, Nazarbayev's regime, obviously tried to control all of the forms of nation building. They tried to control how people would express themselves. They tried to control all sorts of laws that would proclaim certain things, but national programs that would proclaim an eternal Kazakhstani nation, Mangalik Yel, and all of these things that would be pompous when they would be open, but at the same time, 3 or 4 years later, people would forget about them. But what the regime was trying to do, especially Nazarbayev's regime, is that he really tried to contain what he believed, or what the regime believed was the Russo-Kazakh conflict between ethnic Russians and ethnic Kazakhs. And they tried to contain the nation building within the frames of sustaining the authoritarian rule. So that was the main goal of the nationalizing regime at that time.
You also mention the role of Russians and the Russian language in this book too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see the role of Russian these days, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine and the fact that Ukrainians quite vocally have rejected the Russian language? How does the situation differ within Kazakhstan? And how do you think Russian is still a part of Kazakhstani identity?
Your questions are very good. You bomb dropping. Of course, Russian regime is aiming to control, right? And their control in Central Asia is quite strong. We must admit that. They're aiming to control what they call the near abroad, or the sphere of influence. So that still is there. And the way they're doing it is both public through the funding of educational programs, for example, through the influence of their state media. We still have a lot of Russian channels, literally like provided in all the packages if you have a TV set in your home. So all of this is, of course, very, very strong. And there are a number of people who write about Russian propaganda. I'm not going to tap into that. I think it's a field of its own, with its own battles and its own inner logics. But my interest, again, I'm a political sociologist. I'm more interested in sort of looking into what I call regime-society relations, is between the people and the elites at the top, or the people who occupy the power institutions and who have the power, right? And then the second part of your question is sort of like, how does Russian language play out in the Kazakhstani identity? And again, we need to look into history for that. Kazakhstan was among one of the most Russified countries in the Soviet Union. Russification was very dominant and steady. You can look into the early 1920s, that whenever Russian colonialism comes through, it usually comes through language, first of all. And again, some of the decolonial scholars will be a bit critical of me saying that, coloniality is not all about culture and language. But if we look into the history of Soviet Union, precisely of how it tried to get into Kazakhstan since the 1920s, it was the domination and domineering effect of Russian language. My first book was on the kind of cultural elites and the industries of publishing, looking into literature precisely. And I've spent a lot of time in the archives looking into how this was happening. So the Grippling effect on how all of the novels produced and that were allowed to be produced within the Writers' Union, for example, in Kazakhstan, and how many of them were translated into Russian. So if your novel was to be translated into Russian, starting from 1920, so early Soviet period, it was immediately becoming the book that would be given to schools, spread into libraries. Basically, you would get the type of capital that any writer at that time wanted to have, right? But only if it's translated into Russian. I know that it's a little bit long and boring, but all of these things play a hugely important role, looking into how language then transforms that field of cultural production, transforms the field of propaganda and so on, and slowly but steadily occupies all of the spheres of public life, including schooling. That the story that starts essentially with the translation of novels into Russian at the end of Soviet Union, so looking into 1989 in Almaty, transforms into the fact that the biggest city in the Republic has only 2 Kazakh language schools where the education is provided in Kazakh, and then creates disproportionate kind of linguistic practice in this particular city. And Almaty, I think, is an outlier. It's a very colonial city. I write in the book about how Moscow Politburo elites were yelling at local politicians, including Nazarbayev, for example, in 1986, saying, how come you allowed more than 20% of Kazakh speakers or ethnic Kazakhs in the city? So it was kind of it really showed that this was a very colonial city, but also it showed that the city had to be incredibly Russified and Russophone in that sense. So when you're coming from that perspective, saying that the country can overnight turn into other language and forget about Russian, I think is very, very difficult, especially when Russian is entrenched so much that a lot of non-Slavic people considered Russian language their first language or their mother tongue on the eve of the Soviet Union collapse. It's really, really hard. And then coupled with the fact that Nazarbayev regime proclaimed all of these language policies, that people will speak more Kazakh, that state building documents and lawmaking will soon transfer to Kazakh language. If you look into the history from 1991 to roughly mid-2000s, he was promising, but all of his promises were essentially stale. And all of the language programs that he was launching, saying that people would speak Kazakh by 2001, 2002, essentially this was not happening because you have to start with schools. You have to start with the same institutional approach, which was, again, very Sovietized. And essentially it brought the marginalization of Kazakh speakers and Kazakh language in the country. And now it's a very interesting situation because more than 60% of schooling or secondary schooling is happening in Kazakh. The Kazakh speakers are growing in numbers, but at the same time, there is this minority, we can call it now, of people who are neither bilingual or, they can't speak both Kazakh and Russian. They're mostly Russophone. So what do you do with them, right? You can't just basically say that they will not have any representation, that anywhere they go, they won't be able to get service or access to job market, which is actually the case for used to be the case for most of the Kazakh speakers. They could not access job market if they were not speaking Russian. And a lot of Kazakh returnees, Kandases, they called people who were coming from China or returning from China or Mongolia, whose ancestors left Kazakhstan in the 1930s or during Stalinist purges, and now they were coming back in the 90s and in the 2000s. They were actually finding themselves in this position that because they didn't speak Russian, they didn't have any access to a job market or any prospects of getting, for example, a job in, a bank. Now it's completely changing and shifting. Now it's becoming more bilingual. But at the same time, as I said, you cannot turn overnight for everybody just to start speaking Kazakh. It's already a kind of like a hybrid post-colonial moment where both languages play an important role. Sometimes they even merge. You can have this kind of like Shala Kazakh, as it's called, right? The mixture of you start a sentence in Russian, continue in Kazakh, or vice versa. Not particularly like Ukrainian Surzhyk, but something kind of like, heading that way. Very interesting hybrid colonial phenomenon. And when the war started in Ukraine, again, this was a very important moment in Kazakhstan because the society was still overcoming the trauma of the Bloody January. Now it's called Kantar. And there was a lot of questions about what happened, why there was so much violence. And I write about it in the book. It's sort of like people were shocked. And when 24th came and they actually invaded, there was a double shock. And there were, of course, strong pro-Ukrainian movements. We had one of the biggest marches on the 6th of March in Almaty. And at the same time, simultaneously, there was a kind of like a transformation into these grassroots movements, even of Russian speakers themselves, or ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan, who were basically saying, let's open Kazakh-speaking clubs, Kazakh speaking Kazakh, so that essentially slowly and steadily we will be able to at least become bilingual. So there was this turn. But again, I would say that Ukraine is slightly a different case. Of course, it's bigger in terms of population. I think Ukrainian was always, from my experience going to Kyiv quite often before the war, I think Ukrainian was quite more widespread than Kazakh was at that time. And maybe we will get to that level where people will be able to speak some sort of Kazakh predominantly in a few years. But still, you won't see the complete disappearance of Russian in places like Almaty, for example.
When we are talking about Russians, Russian speakers, Russians, or people who identify themselves as Russians, how are they finding themselves in today's Kazakhstan? Because you also mentioned in your book something like the fourth Rus, so the fourth Kazakh tribe, which is supposedly made up of the Russians who stayed here after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Rus is a conglomerate of different tribes. And I think I'm not the first one to use fourth Rus. There's a very interesting historian of tribes in Kazakhstan, Radik Timirgaliyev. He published a very popular book called, I think, Tamga, And my friends were showing it to me and they were like, he included Russians there as well. Russians and everybody else. So ethnic Koreans, descendants of the deportees are there as well. We have a substantial Ukrainian community as well living in Kazakhstan. And there are, of course, other ethnicities. I mean, Crimean Tatars used to be, again, forcibly deported to both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. All of the ethnicities and people who were either forcibly deported by Stalin or came to work on these big projects, like, for example, Tselena in the mid-1950s and 1960s. If you look into any of the industrial cities, you will basically see this diversity of the communities. And I think we need to separate the migration flows, again, from this forced migration or forced deportation. We can look into the pre-Soviet migration as well. So looking into the borders, the Ural city, for example, on the border with Russia, northern Kazakhstan. So we need to separate into when certain, if we're looking into ethnic Russians, when certain ethnic Russians or Slavic groups came in. Some of them, again, might have come in the 19th century. Some of them came on during Soviet times, essentially as laborers and as migrants who were also, I don't know, inspired by certain ideas of Soviet industrialization. So how do they feel right now? And I think, again, in the book, I dedicate like a chapter to that, but I'm currently working because I think it needs to be a bigger project, and I'm currently working on something kind of like a redefinition of Russian-speaking community or Russian-speaking identity. Again, I'm inspired by David Layton's 1998 book. That's where the Russian speaker identity came from, right? And I'm very interested in sort of like what happens to that identity, because in Kazakhstan, there were never Russian speakers. They were always Russians or sometimes Europeans. It's an interesting concept as well that I've found in other Central Asian states, and for example, Dushanbe in Tajikistan or in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, they call themselves also Europeans. We are Europeans, Европейцы. So for us, the Russian speaker is actually somebody who's not ethnic Russian, but speaks Russian as their native language, again, as an effect of colonial policies. So their identity is shifting and changing. And again, I had access to really fantastic studies on focus groups, because I think that's, if we want to get an in-depth understanding of identity, especially of this particular group, we need to ask them. We need to, do qualitative interviews, maybe observations, live in these communities, which is again something as doing fieldwork at home I had access to, or do extended focus groups, but that have to be very kind of like empathetic, and you can't just extract information from these people. You have to be in conversation, in dialogue, which I think is very, very important for a mindful methodology. And I think, as you can see from the discussions, and I'm really glad that the focus group was done after the Crimean annexation, that it shows the shift of how they feel about Russia as well, that they feel that something is wrong, of what is happening, and that they feel that they are local Russians, not in Russia, but in Kazakhstan. And then my book comes at the time when the 2022 war is already, or invasion is already in full-fledged. And we see the arrival of the so-called realokanты, as they call themselves in Russian, but essentially these are the people migrating and avoiding army draft, and some of them stay in Kazakhstan. Of course, they used Kazakhstan as a point of entry because it's the biggest border. And so it creates this, a very interesting juxtaposition between the local Russians and those Russians who come only after 2022. It created a very interesting moment, because local Russians were saying like, oh, these people came and they're not like us. And I think I point out a couple of interviews there, sort of like saying, what it felt like to them. And I think it created the sense of local Russians in Kazakhstan are our Russians, that it's this identity of we, they, ours, theirs, and bore more the sense that these are our Russians. They're not foreign or alien to us. They're part of our society. They're part of our state. They're part of our nation. But essentially that they are part of the community they're living in. And those Russians who came recently, they might become part of that community, but they are a recent, addition. And to me, it was really important to represent this position from my respondents who are local Russians, who were born in third or fourth generation, and how they felt that their identity was changing. Because again, this discussion about Russo-Kazakh divide, it's a very politicized discussion. It used to be manipulated by Nazarbayev a lot, right? He made his speeches in Kazakh and in Russian, and he would really play into this threat that there could be an inter-ethnic conflict, which never actually happened. And then Kremlin plays a lot into this discourse of sort of like, is there suppression or, discrimination of ethnic Russians, of Russian language in Kazakhstan? So it's a highly manipulative discourse.
In your book, you also write about two M words, which are also quite important in the discussions of Kazakhstani identity. So Mambets and Mankurts. These are the two visions of Kazakhstani identity that are being, ridiculed and criticized from various positions. Could you explain what the two words mean and how they frame local identities? Again, I know it's a big question, but maybe we can try.
Yeah, huge questions. Both are the side of the same coin. I think they both are products of colonial division. One, the Mambet, I hate to pronounce it as well, it means a very detrimental word to basically say that it's somebody who lacks culture, somebody who is uncivilized, somebody who comes from usually a village or aul in Kazakh. And you already can sense that it's a very colonial division between kind of like rural, urban, and this kind of like, does somebody has culture, is somebody civilized or not? Does somebody need to be civilized, right? So it comes from that sense, and it's mostly used against ethnic Kazakhs, or used to be used against ethnic Kazakhs. And the word itself comes from a localized name of Prophet Muhammad. So that's another, sensitive issue of why and how it became a slur. And Mankhurt, I think, is the very popular term that a lot of people know through Chingiz Aytmatov's novel and The Day Lasts Longer Than a Century. I've seen Mankhurt quite a lot in, for example, the discussions of the Baltic scholars, Ep Anus, for example, who writes on post-colonialism. Another scholar I forgot her first name, but last name is Kelertes. I read a lot of her work, and she uses it as well. Lithuanian scholars and kind of like cultural elites used that word in the 1980s to basically mention that it's somebody who lost cultural roots. It's the person who became a slave to their master because they completely lost their identity, they lost their culture, they lost their knowledge of their traditions, and that's why they lost their dignity. So both words, as I say, are both two sides of the same coin. You either uncivilized and you need to be colonized in order to gain that civility and culture. And then if you do that, you basically become a mindless person who forgot his or her roots, their roots, and you completely lost your culture. And both words, I think, are very painful because they are usually used as if somebody wants to hurt. And they both are very much the product of the colonial rule. So, and if you want to go for more depth, I should say this here, like, please read the book. I think it's worth it.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting discussion, and I really encourage everyone to read for this book. It changes sometimes our perception of many things that happen in the region and identity questions. There is also one more topic that I would like to raise, but I worry that it's a big one again. Protests. Mm-hmm. Because one of the very important parts of Kazakhstani identity is related to protests, which have changed a lot of how Kazakhstanis see themselves. So maybe without going into great detail, how do you think protests have influenced how Kazakhstanis see themselves? And where are Kazakhstanis today after the Kantar that you've already mentioned?
Well, protests of 1986, 2011, and 2000, I wrote separately about 2019, and essentially 2022 are the red line or red thread that connects the discussion in the book, the narrative, right? And again, I'm a scholar I'm a political sociologist, so I do look into societal aspects. I did write separately a year before this book came out last year. I wrote about the Kazakh Spring because I think this particular protest required like a whole separate big monograph just to look into that. But 1986, and it's a big chapter in the book. I took a very long time, more than a decade, to research for it, because the archives quite literally were burned, and it's the type of protest that defined Kazakhstan even before independence. I look into the violence. I look into how it created this search for self-determination, because essentially what they were saying on the posters is that they wanted to be able to elect their own leaders. And that's where the whole conflict really came from, the protest, because Gorbachev appointed a leader of the whole republic without consulting, even with local elites. The whole process took 17 minutes to dismiss Kunaev, who was a long-term leader, and then appoint Kolpin, 17 minutes. And that also shows, again, the colonial relation between the center and the periphery, because Kazakhstan was seen as a periphery by the Kremlin, and still, I think, is seen as a periphery. And that what spurred the protests in 1986 and created the sense of sort of dignity, right? Namus, what people are demanding. They demand to be heard. They demand to be seen as a viable force within society. But it also, unfortunately, created a sense of trauma, because so much violence was spurred on protesters. And again, it's the type of violence and it's the type of trauma that transformed the Kazakhstani history. And people still commemorate those victims and commemorate those who got affected in 1986. And I think will still require more time to get over and just to make sense of what happened and make sense of what do we do with that particular trauma. But it influenced nation building or national identity in a sense that the Soviet Union believed that it provided more of Kazakh nationalism. That's how they believed and wanted to see that approach, right? It created this cleavage very strongly between ethnic Russians and ethnic Kazakhs. That's where the next chapter on Russian community or Russian identity really starts from, is looking into this colonial myth, into this colonial category that unfortunately in 1986 brought that essentially there would be a conflict between Russians and Kazakhs. But it also, I think, shaped how Russians view themselves in Kazakhstan. And it definitely shaped what it means to be a Kazakh. And after independence, obviously, even Nazarbayev had to tap into that discourse and tap into those meanings that 1986 produced, because he simply could not avoid it. It was too fresh. It was too strong. And even today, any leader who wants to talk about history, they cannot erase 1986. And I think that's a big achievement. Connected to that, I think, jumping quite a few years forward, 2022, Kantar, the violence happened all over the country, but I think it's quite scary and traumatic that some of the most atrocious violence happened on the same square in Almaty as 1986 happened. In 1986, it was called Brezhnev Square, and nowadays it's called the New Square. In 1986, they were speaking to the building that hosted the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. In 2022, they were burning that building that essentially became the mayor's office after independence, because the capital moved to Astana. So all of these things, the architecture, the spaces are fairly symbolic. It's the same square that soaked the blood in 1986 and soaked the blood in 2022. And maybe the two protests are separated quite significantly by temporal divide, by the divide into Soviet times and independence period and so on. But they play a very transformative perspective on the society, how people view themselves. And the violence in that sense, unfortunately, is incredibly transformative, because the way Khantar changed people's understandings, people's perception of who rules them, how they rule them, whether they have legitimate right to rule them in the way they do. All of these things changed tremendously. And we still see a lot of protest potential developed on the streets, but also in social media. If you look into anybody who studies, like Kazakh Telegram can tell you that there are tons of messages every day still discussing Khantar, still discussing what to do next, because the types of problems that Khantar raised are still there. The types of problems of inadequate and bad governance, inflation, unemployment, corruption, coupled with all of these things is still there. And I think Khantar changed Kazakhstani society in the ways that is both divisionary. Unfortunately for us, these two big protests coming with divisions as well. It divides people in the sense of whether such protests or radical changes require so much, victims and trauma and violence. But at the same time, it also divides people in the sense of what to do next, right? But it makes it as a more civically aware society. So we cannot say that Kazakhstani society is sort of like, obedient or silently, submitting to the powers of the regime. They're actually very politically active now. They're very politicized. And it, of course, changes in the sense of identity because they believe that it's not a top-down project. It's not something that people in the Akorda or the presidential palace can decide for them. They are becoming more civically engaged. And I think the more of these protests we see, the more it brings the type of civicness and a sense of sort of like, we as society have the right to actively participate in the political processes of deciding our destiny. So in that sense, I think it really contributes to this understanding of what other scholars call civic identity. And that's where Kazakhstaniness becomes a very potent force of being a civically minded but also politicized force against the regime.
In your book, you mention several times that people still live in January, so that the problems that the protests were against actually haven't been solved. But I wonder how this has influenced the youngest generation. You already mentioned that the younger generation is completely different now, that they are very often multilingual. They do have like new vision of themselves and their identity and where they're going. But I wonder if you could share with our listeners how exactly this new generation has been influenced by the protests, and what do you see in them? Like, how can you maybe define this new generation which is going to form Kazakhstan in the future?
Another huge question.
Sorry.
Every question you ask, I think people should listen, especially like PhD students or somebody. These are really interesting research puzzles. But particularly about the young generation, I was part of the volume that Madeleine Laruelle spearheaded called Nazarbayev generation, the Nazarbayev generation. I am the Nazarbayev generation. And I think the generation that we're seeing now is the post-Nazarbayev generation or whatever. Like, I think we should also delete his name and, the post-Khantar generation, let's put it like that. I think the protest influenced them deeply because, again, the type of violence that emerged highly traumatized but also transformed the society. We cannot escape that. People saw firsthand what was happening on the streets. Of course, the country was cut off from the internet during the vital moments of the protests. But what emerged right afterwards was not, the regime was not able to cap it or avoid they could not basically cancel or delete WhatsApp chats that are ruling political access to information, or they cannot close down Telegram, for example, right? And they do not have these forces. And I should not give them ideas to do that. But essentially, it's a very digitalized society, Kazakhstan. I think the new generation cannot think of itself without their access to digital blogosphere and social media space. Again, that's something I write about in my previous book. And it really influences how they interact, how they socialize, how they politicize. So I think there's a lot less kind of like legitimation of the regime. Young people especially, are very aware of what this regime represents. They're very aware of how violent it can turn on its own citizens. They're very aware of everything that is wrong with that type of regime. And I think, again, we would need to do more studies. But I like what Paper Lab, for example, is doing in Astana. It's a sociological kind of like a hub or agency, not agency, but kind of like a hub of scholars who are interested in opinion polling. And some of their findings are showing that there is, again, as I said, division in the society about what happened in Khantar. Of course, there are still questions about the organized violent groups and so on. But essentially, I think they're showing there are quite interesting kind of like approaches to the very strong pro-democracy sentiments in certain groups. And I think the younger generation is very much part of that strive for pro-democracy. The younger generation still has hopes that the Kazakh Spring, for example, brought in 2019. And they still, I think, when we're going to have elections, they still will be actively participating as, for example, independent observers. And that's an interesting and a very important tendency that happened in 2019, that a lot of young people were volunteering to be independent observers at the election polling stations and so on. So we will see more of that. We will see more political engagement. I cannot predict or speculate on things, but I'm sure there will be some sort of, social movements formations. I definitely see it in the underground artistic circles that I'm working with. And my next book is actually about the protest art movements. And I see that there's a lot of young incentive there among kind of very creative people, young people, Gen Z, who basically do not want to live under authoritarian regimes. And the only way to not do that is basically to fight for the type of democratic future in Kazakhstan. I know that some of my critiques call me overly optimistic. I think there needs to be a little bit of optimism. And again, I'm writing about my own country. I want to be more optimistic than pessimistic. I'm also a sociologist, so I do look into how people feel and experience political reality and what type of incentive they develop. So I don't just look into people as sort of like, categories or points of an equation. I look into them as active actors and agents of change. So, and what I'm seeing through my ethnographic fieldwork is that there is a lot of incentive among this young generation for change and for pro-democracy movements. How it will encapsulate, again, I'm not a fortune teller, but we'll have to wait and see. But I'm sure, and again, I'm very confident in the fact that there is a very strong pro-democracy sentiment among these groups.
Thank you so much, Diana. This was extremely fascinating. And I encourage everyone to read What Does It Mean to Be Kazakhstani by Diana Kudai-Bergen. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.